Thank you, Lisa. Welcome everybody who's joined us, and welcome Stephanie on board. So good to see you all. So first things first, I want to let everybody know that all the slides we'll be showing today are available already online, and here's the link. And today's session is a little bit special because it's going to have two parts. In the first part, we're going to be looking at the American Jobs Plan with a view to thinking about how it intersects with broadband, universal broadband access. And in the second part, we're going to set the stage for a Delphi process. We're going to begin the Delphi process, whereby we're going to select and prioritize some of the potential intersections of the American Jobs Plan with universal broadband for further work. We'll get to that in just a second. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start sharing my slides here. So just 1 second. So if all is going well, you should now be able to see on screen my slide deck. So as I said, we're going to be talking about the American Jobs Plan. But I want to set the stage from the perspective of saying this is not a political pitch. Okay, so this isn't the kind of thing that says go to your representative and immediately tell them to vote for everything on the plan, or go to your representative and tell them to vote against funding everything on the plan. No, that's not the point. The point here is that universal broadband is currently being proposed as part of the American Jobs Plan by the Biden administration as a key priority to look at as things move forward. But it's not the only thing that makes that's listed in the American Jobs Plan. There's a very large list of things in that plan, and many of those things interact with broadband. So the task for today is to start thinking about which of these things interact with broadband crucially, and how do they shape how broadband might be provided, or how universal broadband might be shaped. What other things need to come to the table? Maybe some things are not part of the American Jobs Plan at all. And we're going to go through a special process known as a Delphi process to do so. And we'll see why that process in just a second. But let's start with the American Jobs Plan itself. So the American Jobs Plan enumerates a whole series of priorities in 6 categories. Okay, and let me jump ahead so you can see. There we go. These are the 6 categories of the American Job Plan. Okay, and it says, okay, under these 6 headings, under these 6 major categories, there are a series of proposals for things that should come to pass, things that should come to be looked at, that are of importance to the economic development of the US, to what happens coming out of the pandemic, etc. So we have these 6 categories: fixing highways, rebuilding bridges, upgrading ports, transport, so a whole transportation infrastructure. A second category of other types of infrastructure: drinking water, electric grid, and universal broadband. A third one that it refers to buildings infrastructure, so homes, commercial buildings, and also schools, childcare facilities, veterans hospitals, federal buildings. A fourth category that refers to jobs for home care and wages and benefits for home care workers. A fifth category that looks at manufacturing, supply chains, R&D, and jobs. And a sixth category that looks at saying, okay, so workplaces, what type of structure should the jobs in these workplaces have? What type of development should happen around things like workers' rights, unions, and so on. So those are the 6 categories that, broadly speaking, you find in the American Jobs Plan. Now, as I say, each of these involves elements that can overlap with broadband. So for instance, just take any one of these examples. Let's take one simple example. If we're talking about saying that we're looking at things like buildings and modernizing commercial buildings, then you say, wait a second, if we have universal broadband, then if we're looking at things such as energy consumption in buildings, suddenly that starts to intersect with universal broadband, because we say, well, that means that we can have buildings report out their energy consumption. We can have people in the building know what the consumption is, do things, alter the conditions of the building. In other words, there are intersections between that and universal broadband. Or for instance, if we're talking about things such as training Americans for the jobs of the future, well, that training in and of itself clearly can have a different aspect if universal broadband is available, so everybody can access certain training resources than not. And then we start to ask, well, if these are the jobs that are being proposed, what should broadband look like for this? So you can do an infinity of intersections around broadband in this regard. But what we're going to try to do today is to set the stage for saying, well, which ones are the most salient? Which ones are the highest priority ones? Which ones should we focus on? And to do that, in the first half, we're going to focus on looking a little bit more at the American Jobs Plan in detail. So some interesting resources by way coming into the chat. I'm monitoring the chat as we go along. So please, if people have questions or comments, don't hesitate to put them in the chat. We're also going to be talking a little bit more about how we're sourcing resources as we go through. So we'll go back, and I'm going to show you what happens if you take the American Jobs Plan and you put it into a word cloud tool. All the tools, by the way, are in the slides, linked from the slides if you want to do anything with them. And one of the things that you'll notice is these are the top 54 words in the American Jobs Plan. This is, if you're curious, I'm using the long version, the full text version for this. And some things have come strike you right away as salient. So for instance, you notice that President and Biden are keywords. Well, yes, you'd expect those to show up as the who is proposing this. You also have elements such as Congress as a keyword, etc. So we have all the who's. We also have the other words involved here. For instance, how will this be funded? And you'll notice tax comes in, or how much is this going to cost? And we have billions show up. But we also have some of those priorities in the jobs plan coming to the foreground. So you'll see energy shows up as one of these top 54 words. Water is another top 54 word. So we're seeing certain elements of that infrastructure. Infrastructure itself as a collective noun is an important one here. And as I say, word number 54, if you do the top N words in the word cloud, is broadband. Now that's telling you right away that broadband has a salient piece of the puzzle here. It is not just another thing that got added to the list. It is, if you look at the American Jobs Plan, one of the top tier elements, together with energy, together with water. The clean refers also to water. And it's in the context of all of these different words that either tell you who is doing this, or who's it going to be done for, who is going to be involved, and how it's going to be done. So that's the first thing that should strike you. It should strike you that broadband is not an accidental piece of the American Jobs Plan. It's a fundamental piece of the American Jobs Plan. So we have that, and so Paul is pointing out that President Biden, again, Paul, remember, somebody is putting this forward. Of course, you're going to see certain words show up more saliently than others, but please, 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 I keep coming back to this is not a political analysis we're doing today. That would be a whole different thing, and I'd love to do it someday. Right now, the analysis we're doing is an executive branch has put forward a proposal for what matters. We are going to take apart the pieces of that proposal, and we're going to see how recombining them can yield interesting things. That's it. So I'm not interested in getting into Republican versus Democrat or anything like that in here. Please, let's not go down that path. All right. So we have this, and these are the salient elements, the salient components of the American Jobs Plan. What else can we do? Well, if it is the case that broadband is salient, how is it mentioned? How is it referenced in the American Jobs Plan? And we can look and see what other words are coupled with it. So for instance, we can see, as we're seeing here in this word tree, which words follow broadband. And there are several key elements here. The first one is broadband internet. So we're defining clearly what it is we mean by broadband. In other words, the aspect of internet access. That may be obvious to everybody in this conversation, but it is not necessarily obvious to everybody. And the fact that this is the top tier item is important because it means that at every point, the stress is, it's not just a general pipeline. It's not just, hey, this is how you're going to get your cable shows in the future. The idea is to frame it in the context of an internet access, a certain type of access. The next key element that shows up is this to, and you see both to all Americans and to every American. Now that's important because as you're thinking about this, the proposal has been framed both in terms of a collective, how does this impact the group of Americans as a whole, but it also is to every American. It's a question of how our individual Americans affected? How is each American affected in every way? So as we're thinking about how would the jobs plan, how the components of this job plan intersect with broadband, you want to be thinking about ways that it would affect groups, but also ways in which it would affect individuals. The stage is already set for you in that regard. Then we have the whole question of infrastructure. And there's a question of broadband as infrastructure. No surprise there. The whole plan is heavy on the infrastructure side of things, but it's important that it is conceptualized in that sense as infrastructure for everything else. Coverage becomes the next one, and this goes back to the question of access that has already been discussed. That is an important aspect of why you want universal broadband, because the question is, if you don't have real coverage, you don't have universality of access. And finally, you have a list of individual goals. Again, you've got all these slides. You'll be able to discuss these, to engage with these at greater length. I would encourage you to do that. And if you want to play, by the way, with the text, as I say, the tools necessary to do so are referenced in the document. But you've already got this as a setting. Let's keep going. The question is also, which words lead to broadband? And it's interesting to see that the highlights are affordable and reliable and high speed, leading to others. And then there's a whole list of individual terms, individual aspects that are coming into the picture. So this is also important. And again, I'm not going to be boring and read through each and every one of these. I'm going to encourage you, however, when you have time, because this is a process that we're starting today, but doesn't end today, to look through these and see how each of these defines a separate aspect. So I'm just going to pick up, if you're looking at the ones right below the high-speed grouping, the first one, go to the second one, and you have transportation, safe water, affordable housing, clean electricity, and broadband. It is being grouped together with those items. Again, that's telling you something as to what's already been made top tier, what's already been made key elements, what's already been highlighted in that regard, okay? Tom, again, I do want to emphasize, please, I understand you've got your priorities, but I want to emphasize this is not middle class, there's not lower class, there's not upper class, that's a political question for who should be lobbied, who should be contacted, etc. The key element I want people focusing on, I really don't want distraction, is how the pieces of the puzzle can fit with each other, can intersect. And Paul, you're absolutely right. The affordable, reliable, first, we're using the right mantra in much of our outreach. That is absolutely correct, Paul. And in fact, it's why I wanted to go forward with this group in this analysis, because that's exactly it. The group is already well positioned to undertake this analysis. It's not a group that's viewing this as, well, it's something in the distant future or something for a small elite. No, no, no. That affordable, reliable, high-speed broadband is exactly where we want to go. All right, so we have these. So now let's go through, and I want to do just a little bit of teasing apart of the Jobs Act components. Now go a little bit more atomic so we can undertake the next stage. Okay, I've already shown you the 6 big categories for this. For those of you who are interested in textual analysis, there are different summaries of these categories. You can go to the short version, the shorter version within the long version, and then the heading version, and each of those incorporates something else. It's actually a rather interesting exercise. We don't need to get there, but if you're curious why the phrasing changes a little bit between slides, it's because it also shifts a little bit in the document, and that's an interesting aspect, but fortunately not essential to what we need to look at today. So let's look at each of these 6 now in terms of a little bit more of the atoms that are coming in there, okay? So the first one is build world-class transportation infrastructure, so highways, bridges, ports, airports, and transit systems. And you see that gets subdivided when you go to the long document into transform what's damaged, what's crumbling, what's not working, what needs to be repaired from the past, and also make the infrastructure more resilient, okay? So you have in transform that which is being that has been damaged in the past, etc. You have things such as repair American roads and bridges. Okay, that's fairly clear. Okay, modernize public transport. Now those are 2 different things, etc. So you can go through the list. I really want to emphasize, I'm not going to read every one because otherwise we're doing nothing else today. I just want to highlight the types of things that happen. But also look at the second subcategory in the make the infrastructure more resilient. Okay. So there are aspects such as, for instance, maximize the resilience of land and water resources to protect communities and the environment. Now that's important because we are talking about, for instance, how these transportation repairs, etc., or enhancements to public transportation are occurring, but it also has that aspect. How do we make it so that in doing this, we don't damage the land, we make communities safer, etc. And for anybody who would like a history of how not to do it, we can talk, for instance, about what happened with some of the development when communities were cut through by highways, etc. Clearly, we're looking at something else here. Tom is pointing out correctly that fiber conduit along the length, the dig once type approach, that is indeed an important component that we might think about in this context. So that would be one of those intersections we're talking about. And in fact, we had the current FCC acting commissioner on our discussion sessions a few weeks back. This was an aspect that came up. So that's the first one, okay? The second one is rebuilding the clean drinking water infrastructure, a renewed electric grid, and high-speed broadband. So this is the one where broadband comes in. So notice that it's part of a trio here with drinking water and with an electric grid. Now that's an interesting one. You don't necessarily always think of broadband and water in the same thing, but maybe you should. How? Why? So this should be triggering things. So you'll notice that this subdivides into three, and each of the three corresponds to one of those three categories. So drinking water infrastructure or power infrastructure. And each of them has different aspects, okay? So again, just a very quick one, for instance, replace lead pipes and service lines. So that refers to the health of the water. How do you make sure you don't have antiquated infrastructure damages, right? And these are subsets of ensuring that drinking water. But you notice that you have a whole series of elements about power infrastructures. For instance, one is generating and delivering clean electricity. So we have that clean electricity aspects, right? But you also have build next generation industries in distressed communities. So we have two aspects. One is we want this energy to be clean, but we also wanted to help communities with jobs that don't have don't have jobs or haven't had jobs in this regard. So again, now this begins to start to give you ideas of how do you bring these pieces together, okay? So you have this diagram, you can break them out, start to see what's involved. We also have the question of retrofitting homes and commercial buildings. So building as infrastructure. And notice that we've separated out buildings, homes and commercial buildings, and in one group, schools and learning facilities are in a different group, and veteran hospitals are in a third group altogether. And interestingly, it doesn't have any subcategories to it. So again, this is an interesting aspect in as much as what we're looking at, what's going on, what's happening here, is that education is getting a very separate listing from everything else. What does that mean? Look at some of this. So for instance, you have modernized public schools, but then you have community college as a separate one and childcare facilities as a third. So this isn't try to hit everything in sight in education. It's a very different landscape, a very different set of priorities for different aspects of education. And it's interesting, as I say, that veteran hospitals and federal buildings are in this sort of big lump category. They're not broken out in the way the other two are. The fourth one is jobs and wages for essential home care workers. Now, again, this is an interesting one because we're talking about an idea where infrastructure of a care economy is mediated by how jobs act. Some people have thought of that in the past, some have not. It's important to keep that in mind as you're thinking about it, but you have two subcategories here, which are not so much broken out into subcategories like some of the others. So you have, for instance, access to long-term care services under Medicaid, and then you have put the necessary infrastructure to create middle-class jobs with a fair choice to join a union as an aspect of home care working, okay? So, Tom, do we have any idea what percentage of the education sector, campuses, particularly communities, and K-12 do not have a broadband connection these days? There are statistics in the resources section, Tom, for this group that do get into that. But one of the key issues is, of course, you can have the campus have broadband connections, but not necessarily the students, whether it's community colleges and K-12. And there has been an ongoing topic for discussion in this group. So certainly something to keep in mind. But again, going back to then the care economy, you have the notion, the idea of how this could interact. How would essential home care interact with provision of broadband? What becomes different about these two subsets of aspects of home care if broadband is on the table? The fifth group is the R&D, manufacturing small businesses and training. And again, each of these forms, so investing in R&D and technologies of the future is one group, workforce development is another, and manufacturers and small businesses is yet another. Again, I'm not going to go into all of the leaves, if you will, of these different branches, but keep this in mind as you're thinking about the intersections. Where do intersections look different? What type of intersections spell out, for instance, aspects of research and development, if we follow, say, to that top set in blue, as compared to the ones for workforce development? Do they need to be different? Do there need to be different aspects to it? Sometimes people say, oh, you got broadband, it all happens. No, and that's why we're here today. That's why we want to think about these elements, because it is not necessarily true that if you have what's necessary for, say, one of the R&D aspects, you'll also get the workforce development. If you have one without the other, guess what? The whole thing doesn't work. And the last one goes back to the whole idea of good quality jobs, but now it's no longer just the home care, but the general aspect of home care, of jobs, sorry, not just home care. And you have workers, jobs, and you have empowering workers, protecting workers, so as two separate aspects, and then creation of jobs creation as the third. So that's where we have the American Jobs Act, okay? And those are the subcategories in the American Jobs Plan. Sorry, I said act, it's the American Jobs Plan. In the American Jobs Plan that we need to think about, because each and every one of these, again, spells out a different aspect. So let's go back, for instance, to that R&D aspect. You may think, well, to R&D, one person might think the key element is to have business districts that are incubator districts, and several cities in the US and several communities, et cetera, have done that. You may see that as the key thing. So then you want to think, well, how do you provide broadband so that those are strongly developed? And that will be one type of intersection. Somebody else might say, no, what I think we need to be talking about is more a small scale R&D that is not necessarily well incorporated in the incubator model. So we need to look at the more individual aspect that doesn't work quite as well with incubators and provide broadband with support structures, et cetera, in that regard. And that would be a different intersection for where this works, for where the questions lie. All right. So this is the landscape. Let me take a second now here, because what we're going to do then is to say, okay, so this is the landscape. What are we going to do about it next? I want to pause before we go into the actual Delphi process itself. And just let me ask if everybody in the chat, et cetera, please go ahead and the chat, or if you want to ask the question. Do you see, I'm going to stop sharing for just a second here so we have full screen. There we go. So let me ask you then, is everybody clear on the type of landscape we're looking at? In other words, what we're going to be looking at is to say, not just, hey, we got broadband good, big pipe coming through, yay, we got big pipe coming through, that's it. What we're talking about, what we're looking at is saying, okay, we got broadband and we got all these other things that are being proposed as part of the package. Which ones do we see as most important? And how does broadband need to be provided differently? Or how do these things need to be provided differently to make the best use of this? So let me ask the question, is everybody clear on what we're talking about here? So everybody, I know some of you have read the American Jobs Plan, some of you have not, but does everybody understand the challenge ahead? And don't worry, we're not going to try to do this all in the next half hour here. Okay, so we have here, do we have an agreed upon definition for broadband? So at least 100 Mbps is what we're talking about as a minimum, Damien. But indeed, one of the things that might emerge from this is that's not enough. So if you want to do certain types of smart home monitoring, is that enough? Or do you need to add more to it? That could be a very good question. So there are some basic lines. Again, I'll reference the resources we've already compiled in the group for this, that I believe the link was put in the chat space earlier. But so Lisa, do we need to assume a minimum level of connectivity? Again, what we're talking about here is what does that minimum level look like? You can just assume it's the 100, or you can say, well, it needs to be shaped or be provided or have a certain aspect if it's going to interact with this. And it's very different, you know, just a very simple example. If we're talking about some things along the lines of energy, and we're talking about Internet of Things, okay, then it's a question of which things. Some will take big broadband, some will not. But Lisa, see, here's the thing. You're saying if we dive too much into details, we'll get nowhere. But you see, here's the trick. The process we're going to go through, the Delphi process, will make sure that we actually can each dive into as much of the details as we see appropriate for the individual intersections that we choose to highlight. And Chris says, I would say we know, absolutely, Chris. And here's the thing. Different aspects may predicate different minima. And this is why I keep coming back to that idea of big broadband pipeline without looking at the rest of the landscape. We're probably going to make a mistake. We may underprovide, most likely, overprovide, less likely, but still possible. So this is why this type of aspect is doing this. Jen, are we prioritizing at the 6 AJP levels? No, not quite. I'm going to explain how the whole process works in just a second, although the 6 AJP levels are going to act as a top tier classifier. But the actual questions are going to be at the leaf level, if you will, all the way out for the intersections. The 6 tiers are too big to discuss intersections. Okay. American Jobs Plan. In other words, so Chris, that refers to the American Jobs Plan levels, the 6 tiers, the six key headliners. Okay. So, all right, I'm looking to see if there's any other questions. Again, I see Laurie bringing out aspects of a community and individual access issue, and infrastructure looks at both of those. Absolutely correct. Barnaby pointing out that multimedia rich, etc., requires greater broadband. Absolutely. Okay, David, does the model look to implement this in a permanent way or in 5-year blocks? Very good question, David. That in and of itself may be something that we need to talk about, but this becomes a question of the next stage. So, okay, so Damien, yes, you're going to find some definitions in there, and then you're going to find indirect references. That's been led more by the FCC rather than by the AJP. So, but there are some things that are implicit in the American Jobs Plan. All right, so let me now perhaps, if there are no, I think we're ready to move on to the next stage. So let me set the stage for the next phase, which is the actual Delphi process. So I'm going to go back now and share my slides again. So 1 second, there we go. All right, so here we are. Now, okay, so what could we do? Well, at this point, we could have a nice discussion. We could keep on chatting in the chat. And here's the sad thing, that probably isn't going to work for this. Why? Let me show you why. So one of the reasons that you want to use methods other than discussion, brainstorming, and so on, is that when you're looking at the type of questions we're asking here, where we're asking 2 things. We're asking, 1, what are the intersections? And 2, which ones are most salient, most relevant, how to address them, in what order, and so on. You have 2 possible problems. And this is taken from a paper that Dan Kahneman and his team published about 5 years ago. And it's the question of noise and bias. When you're looking at a question like this, when you're saying, how do different elements come together? Which ones are, how do they come together, and which ones are more salient, and which ones should we prioritize? You'd want something that looks like A, that's nice and accurate. In other words, you'd want to be able, in a group with expertise like this. Yep, Damien just put the most recent article by Kahneman there, that's correct. And I'll have something else to announce in that regard in just a second. So you'd want everything to be there. You'd want the recommendations to be tightly packed, in other words, to be accurate. And you'd want them to not be biased. You'd want the spectrum of thinking, the spectrum of experience that everybody in this group brings to the table to not be slanted in one direction. Traditional discussion processes, unfortunately, tend to fail to produce this type of outcome. They tend to fail to produce an unbiased outcome because, unfortunately, it's either the loudest or the most respected or the most experienced in terms of how many years, etc., voice in the room tends to get heard. And one of the issues is that's not what you want, because some of the really important ones, maybe in fact the ones that some of those of us who have been in the trenches, and I'll put myself in that group for many, many years, may be completely blind to. We've been doing this so damn long, we're missing the obvious sometimes, or missing the non-obvious. And somebody who comes in at it from a different angle might miss some of the things that we're missing, but suddenly see something that's important, and our people say, oh, wow, that's a very good point. We should look at that. So traditional discussion processes tend to produce outcomes that are biased. And to make things worse, they can also provide outcomes that are noisy, because then sometimes you'll get people who say, well, I like that, and I like that. And then we wind up with something that's just a hodgepodge of recommendations for where you should have interactions between elements of the AJP, for instance, and universal broadband in our case, rather than a tight group. And they're all over the place. And frankly, none of them are terribly salient. And the worst case, of course, is where you get D, which is both noisy and biased. So traditional discussion methods, brainstorming, traditional discussion groups, breakout groups, do not work well to reduce this. They are great for other things, but they don't work well at this stage when we're trying to identify what are those possible intersections and which ones are most highly prioritized, which ones are most salient, which ones are most relevant in this process. And there's a whole series of approaches that you can take. And Damien just put in the chat space a link to a recent article with Kahneman and also Sibony and Sunstein. And Kahneman, Sibony, and Sunstein published today was the release date, a new book called Noise, How to Overcome the High Hidden Cost of Inconsistent Decision Making, where they discuss in detail both the problem as well as multiple approaches to solve it. So the one we're talking about is right now one of the approaches, and yes, they do mention this one in their book, which is a modified Delphi process, which tries to say, well, how do we do this? How do we aggregate knowledge in a way that plucks as much as we can from the minds of the people at the table, from the experts at the table, but doesn't get into either noisiness or bias? So what we want is the relevant knowledge, okay? We can, if you take those leaves in the diagram I just showed you and the idea of broadband, we could spend decades spinning out every possible one. We don't want that. We want the tight core of knowledge that's most salient right now, the one we want to act on now, one that's most important to get those results, to get broadband to its maximum potential in the intersection, and that shapes everything, that tells us, whoa, it's not 100, we need 1,000 megabits per second, we need 1,000,000 megabits per second. I know I'm exaggerating, but you get the picture, okay? And we don't need cars that do X for electric cars, we need cars that do Y for electric cars. We don't need jobs grouped together in this way, we need jobs grouped together in that way, but we need it for now. Not for 10 years from now, we need it for now, because now is the decision scope. So we want the relevant knowledge. So if we, each of us, bring in our knowledge, we can say, well, here's expert A. So I'm going to say this is Aura. Here's expert B. Let's say it's Lisa. And here's expert C. Let's say it's Damien. Okay, and we keep on aggregating. And each of them has views on how these different things come together and which ones are more important and so on. And they form a huge spectrum. They're much, much, much bigger than the relevant space. Okay. And because we have 20 people here, we have 20 of these experts, not drawn to scale because I couldn't fit 20 circles in there. But what we need to do is to say, okay, so we seed the field. We get people to contribute as much as possible. So that's the first stage of a Delphi process. But here's the important thing. We don't get them to contribute by saying, okay, we'll break out into rooms and you'll discuss this. No, we're going to see, and I've created a Google form for people to submit as many of these intersections as they think are relevant, with appropriate resources. If they have a resource, if they don't, that's fine too. They may say something is relevant. I say, I can see that's relevant, and no, I don't have a reference, but that's fine. That's okay too. We need to be able to get both the moment of intuition of these things fit together in this way, but we also need the, you know what, I've been working on this for 50 years, and this is what results from it, and here's a key link to document how to think about this. So in stage one, we're going to ask for people to contribute, but this is important independently. I do not want to say, let's break out into rooms and discuss this. This is the, okay, there's going to be a form, and each of you is going to be able to submit through this form as many of these seeds as possible. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in, and I'm going to do this on Friday, but I'll tell you more about that in just a second. I'm going to say, okay, we're done. I'm going to shut off the form, and then I'm going to aggregate the reply. So if 10 people put down the same thing with slight changes in wording, I'm just going to aggregate them into one reply, and I'm going to give everybody a link to those replies and to the resources that were associated with each reply, so that you can look and say, okay, so this is, you'll see what you put in there, but you also see what other people put in independently. And I keep coming back to, it's important that it's every independent person contributing to this, not as a group, independent. That's what we're doing. As soon as you start going as a group, you completely mess up this. So it's important to realize that in a true Delphi, whether it's a regular Delphi or a modified Delphi, the independence of the contributors is important. And absolutely right, Lisa, each gives you your own response. That's right. So you have here the inform the process aspect. So you have the resources, and you'll be able to see what's the set of resources that have been proposed, and what are the intersections that people have put forward. And then finally, we're going to do this in two stages. In the first stage, you're going to be given a certain number of votes. I'll show you in just a second how many votes you're going to be given. And you're going to say, okay, these are the most important things from this very long list of everything put together. Now you go back into your space, you go back into that space where you've looked at the resource and so on. So, okay, after thinking about this, putting together my expertise with what I've seen out there, these are the ones I see as most safe. And I'm going to show you, the voting is a little different from usual, but for now, just think about it as it's a voting process that brings the expertise together. And once we've gone through that, we're going to wind up with a short list. And then we're going to do that short list. And what we're going to do with that short list is we're going to winnow it down further to a tight core. And that tight core is going to be what we report out, we use in this broadband group for further development, if we choose to do so, or we send out to others with the, okay, this is what we see as important, this is what we see as crucial. This can also inform a political process. Somebody could look at that winnow down list and say, aha, this must be funded, but maybe it's not funded at the federal level, state level. Maybe it's not even at the state level. Maybe you look for public partnerships, maybe it's just by, I don't know. That's a separate question altogether, but this list is important and it's useful because it says, if you have X and you have Y and the intersections come together, these are the intersections that are most relevant. These are things to keep in mind, and these are the things that to keep in mind that are most relevant at those intersections. So the idea is that that list, that winnowed down focused list, which is just going to be a few, it's not going to be many, it's probably going to be 3, as I'm going to show you in just a second. Key elements is going to be the end product with the supporting documentation, with the supporting and expanded description to explain what each one of them is. So that's what we're doing here. We're not answering any final questions. We're not saying, and this is what we should do, the thing. No. We're setting the stage for saying, what should we be looking at, why, and how? And then it's back into the arena where other methods, other approaches can deal with this. Okay, so that's a Delphi in a nutshell. So this, as I say, goes through 2 rounds of fun. So you're going to get a form to contribute. I'm going to give you a link to that form in just a second so you can see it in action, ask questions if you have any problems with it. And then we have here the first round voting method. Okay, so how are we going to vote? Okay, this is a question. You saw that diagram I showed you. It's a little bit like throwing darts. And each of us has better or a shakier or less shaky hand. And what we're doing is we're averaging out all the darts. So the reason why this is, as you're going to see, a square root relationship, etc., we're going to say anybody who's curious, I can give you the statistics and why this works out. But suppose that after I go through and I aggregate, I put everything together for people to look at resources, there are 50, let's say, of these intersections that were identified by people, okay? Then if it's 50, it's the square root of 50, that's close to 40, and so let's say it's 7. So I'm gonna give everybody 7 votes. And then I'm gonna say, okay, here are 50 replies, vote for however many you want using these tokens. So you think, I just want this is the only one that matters. Boom, put all 7 tokens on that. You say, well, these 2 matters, but this one matters a little bit more than this one. So you put maybe 4 on the one that matters a little bit more, 3 on the one that matters less. Or you say, you know what, I can't, there are 7 that are about equally good, and you put 7 on there. The key thing is this forces you to focus. It forces you to do this. And the fact that it's the square root of it, as I say, statistically, I can show that that's a good number for most reasonable scenarios. I can create pathological scenarios, but we won't get into that right now. So that's a good number. And that means that you're all going to be voting. And again, that's where the intersection of the knowledge comes in. Because it's very unlikely that every response you voted, if you voted for 7 different responses, is going to be part of the final set. But the overlapping intersections are going to give us a prioritized list that's going to be that bigger circle I showed you, showing up at the end. So the top T replies, so a square root of n. So in our case, in this example, I said, well, we have 50 items identified, 7, the top 7. If there's a tie, obviously all the ones that tied. So if you have 6 and then 3 more that tied, it could be 9. But let's say it's the top T, the top 7 replies will be selected for the second round of voting. And in the second round of voting, it's how many replies do we want? And again, it's a question of how many do you have relative to how many you've generated. So if you have 7 replies generated, you really can't winnow it down to much. You can't have more than half. So 3 would be a good choice. And it turns out that you need a lot of replies before you can have much more than 3. So for now, I'm listing at 3. If it turns out that we have 500 replies, then this number might go up. But let's assume it's 3 for now, because we want the top 3 items. And now you can do exactly the same sort of thing. Put all 3 on one, distribute them. That's up to you. But people always ask me, why can't you just use the priority list you generated in the previous step? And the answer is because maybe none of your choices from the first round made it in there, but your outlook is still valid. Your perspective is still valuable. And this gives you a chance to reprioritize, to say, okay, none of my choices made it, but these 3 did. But these did. From these, which 3 or 2 or 1, depending on how you choose to distribute your votes, are the ones I would pick as the top priority. And even if some of your choices or all of your choices made it, you might decide, now that I look at the subset, I might decide to shift my perspective a little bit. So again, that double focusing prospect has the aspect of changing perspectives in 2 stages. One stage that we're looking at, and another stage that says, now let me rethink this, okay? Now, as you can guess, this is not a process that's going to happen right now in 5 minutes or 10 minutes. This is a process that I'm going to give you 72 hours for producing options, for producing these choices. Then I'm going to go in over the weekend, create that grouping, give you a chance to look over them and look at resources. And then we're going to do the voting in 2 rounds over the next 2 weeks. Okay? So if you're worried about how are we going to do all of this in 9 minutes, don't worry, we're not going to do this in 9 minutes. What we're going to do in 9 minutes is I'm going to introduce you to the link to the form that you want. And I'm going to give you a chance to ask questions about the Delphi process, give you a chance to ask questions about the form. But at that point, we're going to wrap it up because you've all been very patient to be a part of this for all along, and I want to honor your time. So let me put in here now. Let me stop sharing so we have the full screen again, and I can see the chat and everything more clearly. So let me give you now a link to the slides. And here we go. 1 second. Sorry, you already have a link to the slides. I'm sorry, I mean a link to the survey. Okay, and
Ruben, are you saying the link is in the slides we downloaded?
the link is not in the slides you download. Sorry, no, because I wanted to keep the two separate. So here's, now you have a link to the survey. Okay, so the link to the survey is now in the chat. Okay. And again, one of the things we're going to do is we're also going to mail people who registered for this session. So if you sign off and then say, oh, wait, I deleted it and I erased my browser history and I have absolutely no recollection of Ruben's or Lisa's or anybody's email here, don't worry, we'll still pester you with this. So you can't get away from us that easily, I promise. All right. So right now you have the slide, the link to this on screen. And if you want, in fact, here, let me just very quickly, I'll put that on my own screen as well, just so you can see this. So 1 second. Okay, let me see if I can display this on screen. 1 sec. So screen.
Ruben, while you're doing that, in a Delphi, yep, is it appropriate to use the Chicago method of voting, namely vote often?
The Chicago method of voting, vote often. You're not going to have the option. In other words,
you get to vote once.
If you submit the same thing multiple times, all that's going to happen is I'm going to be a little annoyed and I'm going to, winnow them, put them all down as one for people to look at. And when you get voting, you're only going to get, I'm sorry to say, your own votes. You will not be able to raise the dead to get them to vote. You will not be able to show up with a, Groucho Marx mustache at the voting booth and convince people that you should be able to vote again. In fact, that's actually quite a rarity.
It's more that I can see two things that I'd like to vote for, but you'd like me to pick one.
Yep, and sometimes that's going to be tough. One of the things I want to do is I want to tax. So you're going to say that's going to force me to make decisions. Absolutely, that's exactly the point. That's exactly one of the points of Delphi. When people say, "But if I only had one more vote, I could pick that myself." But see, I want to force you to think deep. I want you to force you to reach within you and say, well, truthfully, which one of these do I feel like prioritizing? Or conversely, say, I think this is twice as important as the other one. So I think right now I should be showing you on screen what I was referring to. So this is the form. And again, there's a nice little explanation at the top if you need a refresher. And the questions are very simple. The two required questions are, which of the big 6 headers is this going to fall under? And if you're not unsure, you can always go back to the slides if you need more detail. Most of them are pretty self-descriptive, so it's pretty easy to figure it out, but you have both the slides and this. And then please describe your example briefly. In other words, please, not a paragraph, 1 sentence, preferably, 3 sentences max. Remember, I'm the poor person. This is not going to be handled by an AI. I cannot afford to pay for GPT or any of the really fancy AI engines that might be able to create summaries here. Mind you, I don't think they do a very good job, so I probably wouldn't do that anyway. But even if they did, so we say muscle here is yours truly. So I need to have this in a compact format. And to be perfectly frank, if it's much more than 1 to 3 sentences, in every study that's been done of how Delphi's work is, nobody reads them anyway, and people lose interest. So keep it short. The shorter, the better. 1 sentence ideal, 2, okay, 3 max, and please avoid that if at all possible. And then if you have a URL and just one URL, okay, a key link that you think, say, look, this is really important, and here's a perfect example or perfect explanation or a perfect illustration, great, include that. But don't feel that if you don't have that, you can't add yours, you can't add this. And because it might well be that you see this and you say, you know what, I've never seen this discussed, but I think this should be discussed. And that's great. That's exactly the type of expertise that we want to make sure we don't lose at the table. Also, because Damien will scold me if I don't mention this, I will mention that this is completely anonymous. In other words, I will not, I have no way. Okay, yes, I suppose if I wanted to trace your IP address and ask your ISP for your IP address. No, listen, it's very simple. this is anonymous. Again, the reason it has to be anonymous is very simple. I don't want this to become the so-and-so who's very experienced said X. As soon as you do that, you poison the well immediately. Okay, so it's anonymous, so feel free. If you're feeling, gee, I feel kind of, I don't know, is this, but I think this should be there and you're kind of uncertain, don't worry, I won't know who you are. I really won't. So, so because of that, please be assured that anonymity will be preserved at every stage, both because it is an essential feature of the Delphi process, but also out of respect. In other words, when I, all joking aside, when I say something is anonymous, something is anonymous. The only thing that we'll know is who's the whole set of people that got a link to this, but that's it. I have no way of identifying individual responses, etc. All right, so what's an example mean as well? So for instance, if we're talking about a practical example, I'm talking about water consumption. The link I have there for the Hitachi is a perfect example. Okay, so if we're talking about, you have broadband. Broadband arrives at every home. Broadband can now get Internet of Things information about your home that you can use as the person living in that home, as well as the city can use it as a whole. Here's an example of how this has worked out in smart cities work in the past, or here's things that have not worked out. Negative examples also matter. I'll mention one thing, for instance, that's been done, since I'm on that example, that's been done is when you have the individual homeowner having greater awareness of their habits, tends to encourage better water usage and consumption, but also when the city has access to this, you can sometimes spot things such as major pipe ruptures, issues that you wouldn't otherwise catch easily and deal with them before they become major problems, because you say, whoa, why did the consumption increase in this way in this area? So those are examples. An example of jobs would be this type of, say, incubator has produced this type of new type of enterprise, and they are the ones in Kansas City, for instance, that have had this experience working with women of color to produce new types of jobs in the area. So an example of how that job was leveraged by broadband in a certain way that would not have been possible without broadband would be a good example. So those are two cases that come to mind. And again, if any of you have any questions, etc., please feel free to contact me. I'll be more than happy to answer them. The one thing I will not do is I won't tell you if your example is good or bad or otherwise, just please submit them. Don't feel that you have to clear it with anybody, just really, we're dealing and working with each and every one of you as thoughtful people who bring thinking, who bring expertise, who bring knowledge, and who bring contexts, very different contexts for each of us that we couldn't have otherwise. Barnaby, no, not necessarily, unless there's a particular, if you feel that a particular thing leads to a clear policy recommendation, you can put them in 1 to 3 sentences, go for it, but not necessarily that, no. To me, the policy recommendations are the thing that comes next after this. In some cases, maybe there is a unique policy recommendation, and if so, by all means, put it into the mix, but that's not necessarily what we're looking at here. Other questions or other comments?
Well, I know we're right at time and a good handful of us have to hop right to another call. Can I suggest that people follow up with you by email, Ruben, with additional questions?
Absolutely. So let me put my email here. So thank you all for coming and for being part of it. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what the results from the process. I'm really excited. So thank you.